The more that time passes, the more I've come to view Titanfall 2 as the gold standard for a first-person shooter. If you're a fan of Apex Legends, then you have this game to thank for conceiving it. If you're a fan of Titanfall 2, then you have Apex to thank for killing it. EA is responsible for the game's modest sales by deciding to sandwich the release between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, effectively smothering what is otherwise one of the greatest FPS experiences to be released in 2016, but a lot of people will agree that the runaway success of Apex Legends is what's keeping Titanfall 3 out of the picture. I found myself thinking about what would have been if Apex wasn't as successful, and I wonder if EA would have put Respawn on the chopping block for it. It's an interesting line of thought. The game that killed Titanfall may have saved the studio who invented it. Still, Apex is by no means a replacement for Titanfall, and it's a shame that it's now the studio's main focus. As somebody who is sick to death of battle royales ever since my favorite one got abandoned just so Hi-Rez could focus on putting out a generic third-person hero shooter called Rogue Company, Apex is a massive point of contention for me. I was one of the many people who bought Titanfall 2 at release and have loved it ever since. I never put a lot of time into multiplayer, which I'm only recently starting to bitterly regret, but I've played the campaign several times over the years. I found more flaws with the story on my most recent playthroughs than I had my previous runs, but I still think what is here is pretty solid. I did test out some of the multiplayer whenever I was gathering footage for this video, and I found that everything good about the campaign is even better in the multiplayer. I was having a really good time. My first match I was doing alright, and then suddenly my game froze and I wasn't able to do anything except leave the match. I figured that it was just a server error since the game's servers didn't seem entirely stable in the menu, with my loadouts frequently resetting to default and the multiplayer occasionally crashing. My second match, I was doing much better, beginning the game with a triple pilot kill and proceeding to go on a serious kill streak. Then, as I'm chasing down the other players with my Titan, the game froze again. After looking into it for a few minutes, it appears that Respawn servers have been subject to DDoS attacks. The severity of these attacks has fluctuated over time, and there's a pinned thread in the Titanfall subreddit that is giving frequent updates about the playability of the servers. I apparently chose to play the game when the attacks were at their worst, and seeing as the issues have been ongoing for months, a solution doesn't appear to be in sight. The persistence of these attacks appears to be why Respawn has announced that they're pulling the original Titanfall from the shelves, although they're not shutting down the servers altogether. This means that 95% of this video is going to be covering the campaign, with only a few references to the multiplayer here and there. I would have liked to spend some time going over the different game modes in Titans, since there is a gameplay difference between the campaign and multiplayer, but we're over a month removed from my last attempt and the multiplayer still loses connection and kicks me out every 5 minutes, so I'm very reluctant to spend my time trying. There is a bit of a silver lining with the Northstar servers on PC, but I own the game on PlayStation, and I've heard that the servers still feel like a work in progress. To the hackers who are DDoSing the official servers, if you're listening, I have just one thing to say to you. You can hit the Apex servers all you want, but please leave Titanfall alone. Onto the gameplay. There are a lot of elements that make it feel very satisfying. Everything in this game has been fine-tuned to set it apart from its competition. Futuristic shooters were becoming a little oversaturated by the time Titanfall 2 released, mostly due to the number of Call of Duty games that were using enhanced mobility mechanics. I was one of the many people who were sick to death of this concept by 2016, but I gave this game a chance because I was more interested in the Titan aspect of the game. If you passed this game up because you thought it was going to be another bog-standard futuristic shooter, and you haven't heard the mountain of praise this game has received ever since, then I'm happy to report that Titanfall 2 is the best iteration of these mechanics I've seen to this day. As with all good games, the aspects of the gameplay are tightly integrated to complement each other, which makes it difficult to talk about them individually. However, the elements are easy to identify: combat, movement, and platforming. Each of these come together to complement the others in their own way. With movement and platforming being so interconnected, I'm sure some of you watching would argue they're the same thing. You'll see shortly why I'm addressing them separately. Combat, as always, is going to be the broadest topic, as there are even more elements that make it what it is. You have a lot of tools at your disposal in the campaign, and even more in the multiplayer. Much of your loadout is standard for first-person shooters. You can carry up to 2 weapons in the campaign, and 3 in the multiplayer, since you can carry 2 secondaries with a pistol and a launcher. You have a special ability that is determined by what pilot class you play as in the multiplayer, but you will always have the tactical cloak in the campaign, except for one mission that swaps it out for a unique gimmick that mostly serves the same purpose. If you've played Apex, then you're likely familiar with the majority of the weapons available, although the Car and Vault SMGs were always in the base game at launch. These weapons also appear to have more recoil in Apex than they did in Titanfall. The game is also missing a few weapons from Apex, such as the Peacekeeper shotgun, the 30-30 repeater, the compact bow, the Rampart LMG, and the Prowler SMG. The lack of these weapons isn't really felt since you'll only have access to specific weapons during each level, with very few exceptions. That's not to say that there's a lack of weapon variety, only that you won't be carrying the same loadout throughout the entire game. This brings some light looter shooter elements to the game where you're frequently dropping the weapons that are out of ammo in favor of something more common for that level, which forces you to try out almost every weapon at least once throughout the campaign. The variety of different weapons available throughout the campaign means that this can almost become an entire playstyle in and of itself, although I wouldn't say this is something unique to Titanfall 2 since you can technically do this in any first-person shooter. It's more that Titanfall 2's run-and-gun heavy combat arenas make the act of picking up new weapons on the fly feel far more viable than in a game like Call of Duty. On the equipment side, there are 5 different grenade types: frag grenades, which everybody should be familiar with, arc grenades, which explode on impact and do electric damage, satchels, which work in this game like C4 does in others, fire stars, which are throwing stars laced with thermite, and the rare gravity stars that pull enemies into its singularity before exploding. I only found that last one on my second playthrough and didn't get much time to play around with it before they vanished forever. There's also an electric smoke grenade that I only found recently because it's in a level that I enjoy getting through as quickly as possible. It's much more common in the multiplayer though. Throwables have their trajectory displayed so you can see exactly where they're going to land before throwing, which is useful if you need to get a grenade down range quickly and accurately. This is especially useful for throwing stars since you need to hit your target for them to be effective. Lastly, you have the pilot classes. As I mentioned a moment ago, you'll only have access to the cloak in the campaign, but the multiplayer gives you access to more abilities. I wanted to get some gameplay footage of the abilities in action, but I wasn't sure how I could unlock them all due to the aforementioned DDoS attacks. But knowing this is a 2016 EA title, I also know that there's no problem that you can't solve with a debit card. For probably the first time in their entire existence, microtransactions saved the day. Less than $3 later, we were set. But how are the different pilot classes? Well, with the literal one really good multiplayer match I got, I'd say they all sport their own utility. It's worth saying again that I only tested these in one multiplayer game, which I was very fortunate to be allowed to play to the end. A few minutes isn't really enough time to get a good feel for how these abilities work, but there's not an awful lot to analyze with them either. There are multiple other videos out there that go into way more detail about the situational use of these classes than I will. The Pulse Blade works as a sonar pulse that spots enemies within its range and is useful for spotting enemy pilots and getting an edge in close quarters. The Grapple, as the name suggests, is a grappling hook that prevents you from firing while using it, but it's also useful for latching onto enemy titans so you can get up close and pull their batteries out, which is a good tactic for doing decent damage to them. The stim heals you and temporarily boosts your speed, although I found this effect to be very underwhelming. I can see it being useful if you need to rush down an enemy or their titan. The AWOL creates a particle shield in front of the pilot that blocks incoming damage. A camper's tool to be sure, so it's kinda lame, but it does amplify your shots that are fired out of it, so it has some utility. It would be far more useful on an objective-based game mode than the standard TDM. The phase shift teleports you into another dimension, so to speak, where the enemy can't see or hurt you, but you also can't see or hurt them. Naturally, this would be really useful for getting the drop on an enemy with no chance of them spotting you cloaked. Lastly, the Holopilot lets you create a hologram to trick the AI and other players, which is also kinda lame. Almost all of these abilities have been transferred to Apex in some capacity. The Sonar Blade was reworked into the Vision Pulse and given to Bloodhound. Pathfinder was given the grappling hook, Octane has the stim, the AWOL was reworked into a dome and given to Gibraltar, and then straight ported to Rampart, the phase shift's duration was increased and given to Wraith, and the hologram was given to Mirage. The only ability that's unique to Titanfall is the cloak, and that's likely just a balancing issue. Regardless, it would have been nice if these abilities were scattered around the levels in the campaign like the different pickups in Halo, since they could add some nice variety to the way you get through the game. I think limiting the player to only the cloak removes some depth from the combat system and prevents the player from practicing with their preferred multiplayer loadout in the campaign. However, it's worth noting that the cloak is a very important survival tool in the higher difficulties, and abilities like the Pulse Blade, grappling hook, and the stim wouldn't work as well in all situations. The grappling hook and stim specifically may break the platforming, which the game relies on for some of its collectibles. But that doesn't mean that the concept shouldn't have been explored at all. These aren't particularly difficult issues to fix. Allowing the use of different abilities would give much more variety with how you handle the different encounters in the game and could have given more freedom to the developers to make the combat throughout the campaign even more varied. This is a bit of a weird take considering that Titanfall 2 already has a lot of variety in its levels compared to most games in the genre, but much of the combat stays relatively the same throughout. Adding these different abilities would mean that some levels can come to rely on them. Just like how you're forced to change weapons throughout each level, you would also be forced to pick up a new loadout to progress through certain areas. The grapple could be used to get through some platforming gauntlets, or the sonar pulse could be required to get through a tightly packed area where there isn't enough room for platforming. The rest of the abilities would be more common to support your preferred playstyle, but this would go a long way towards making what is already a very diverse experience even more so. Moving on to the gunplay, I originally had a 3-page tangent on how poorly guns are simulated in other first-person shooters and how this game avoids some of those shortcomings, but all of it can be summarized by saying that Titanfall 2 has satisfying gunplay. The animations are smooth and fluid, the different weapons' recoil patterns are easy to understand and control, and each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. That's really all that needs to be said about the gunplay itself, but a bigger criticism that holds true is that the game is a very SMG and assault rifle dominated experience. The SMGs specifically are some of the most useful weapons of the game, especially the CAR for its low recoil and high rate of fire, but the ARs get their own chance to shine as well. I've gotten use out of the L-Star and Spitfire LMGs, and I only picked up the Spitfire while attempting and failing to beat the game on Master difficulty because I needed the extra range and magazine size so I could stop getting clapped every time I started moving. I never found any use for the snipers in this game, mostly because they're simply not compatible with my playstyle, and the launchers are only really useful against the larger Reaper bots. The shotguns are more useful, the Mastiff and Mozambique especially, for their larger range, but I still found myself dropping them the second I came across a CAR or R97. This is only really a problem in the campaign, since the multiplayer will obviously have more uses for these, but good luck finding a server if you're not on PC. Despite these minor issues, it's worth saying that Titanfall 2's gunplay stands out from the competition, and this is even more true for the movement mechanics. Other games that feature enhanced mobility, like Infinite Warfare, which also released in 2016, feel incredibly floaty and awkward to use. Just getting this footage from the game felt unnatural after 2 playthroughs of Titanfall 2. Your movements are slow, and wall running feels clunkier and more difficult to pull off. There's a serious lack of momentum, which is the biggest thing that makes Titanfall 2 feel so much better by comparison. Sprinting and wall running in this game causes you to build speed, and your momentum can be lost in a variety of ways. However, it can also be maintained and used to your advantage in combat. The classic rule of moving faster makes you harder to hit applies in this game, and death can come quickly on the higher difficulties if you don't make proper use of your movement abilities. Pairing the game's great shooting and movement mechanics facilitates a fast-paced style of gameplay that is heavy on platforming and discourages you from stopping. The tactical cloak is used more for evasion than it is stealth, and it's critical to surviving the more intense firefights. I found the game to be the most enjoyable when I was ending encounters and getting through levels quickly, and I started to appreciate how the various arenas throughout the game facilitate this playstyle. But before we move on, we need to take a moment to talk about Master difficulty. I haven't beaten the game on this difficulty just yet, mostly because it's a bit outside my skill level and I got tired of dying every 5 seconds. Thankfully, the loading screens are much quicker on my brand new PS5 than they were on the PS4. I also discovered the FOV slider, which really screws with the camera in cutscenes. I would have played the entire game like this, but I found it too hard to take things seriously, so I reduced it to a more acceptable range. I haven't spent enough time on Master difficulty to form a fair opinion of it, but what I can say with certainty is that the difference between it and hard mode is significant. Enemies are very accurate, and the only way you can shake them is if you keep moving. The issue I ran into is that they would still be able to kill me during platforming, which resulted in more than a couple rage quits. I also seem to get the unluckiest checkpoints where I'd be staring at 2 enemies that can easily laser me if I don't move immediately, so I would have to start each attempt by wasting my cloak just to prevent from dying the second I load. What I can say is that if you find hard mode too easy and you really want to put your skills to the test, then Master is the mode for you, but the name is not there for show. This mode is brutal and unforgiving, and that's just not the kind of experience I'm looking for right now. This is the type of thing that I would enjoy more if I streamed it instead of just playing it solo. All of this, and we haven't even talked about the Titan combat. When you're not engaged in a high-speed murder spree, you're usually fighting from inside a Titan. The multiplayer has several different Titans to choose from with their own abilities and stats that help them stand out. Smaller Titans with less health, like the Ronin or Northstar, are more nimble, whereas heavier Titans like the Scourge or Legion have a larger health pool but are much slower by comparison. I won't be speaking at length about each Titan individually since I haven't put enough time into the multiplayer to really talk about them, but I will be talking about the Titan loadouts. Since you can't change your Titan in the campaign, you acquire different Titan loadouts that give the abilities of the Titans in the multiplayer. Each loadout in the game is named after the Titan it corresponds with, except for the Expedition loadout that you start the game with since it's used by the Monarch Titan that was introduced with the Monarch's Reign DLC 7 months after release. The Brute loadout also doesn't appear in the multiplayer, likely because its abilities are already covered by other Titans. The Monarch Titan itself is modeled after the Vanguard class Titan that you use in the campaign. The Titan combat doesn't require the same fast-paced run and gun style that you use when you're fighting on your own. You have access to a few abilities that are determined by your loadout and 2 dashes to avoid enemy attacks with. Each Titan loadout encourages a slightly different playstyle, especially in the multiplayer with the differences in health and mobility, but the campaign has some common threads between each of them. You'll ultimately be throwing everything you have at the enemy Titans while using dodges or defensive abilities to minimize the damage you take. For aggressive players like myself, this turned into a methodical dance where my main tactic was attrition, throwing everything I had at the enemies until I had fully charged my core ability, which basically meant the fight was over in most situations. You charge your core by landing shots on or killing enemy titans, which allows you to unleash a brief yet devastating attack that is unique to most titan loadouts. I can't talk much more about the different playstyles without telling you how the different loadouts function, so let's go through them one by one. The Expedition loadout that you start the game with uses a 20mm chain gun as its primary weapon that needs to reload after 30 shots. Your abilities include a shoulder-mounted, multi-target rocket launcher that can target titans and personnel alike, and an AoE anti-personnel electric smoke similar to those grenades I mentioned earlier. Your defensive ability creates a vortex to grab incoming shots from the enemies and launch it back at them. An interesting thing to note about the vortex is that whatever it stops is actually returned to the enemy, instead of becoming a standardized projectile. The developers took the time to make sure that the shots from infantry, rockets, and those from the various titan loadouts are grabbed and sent back, so you can do big damage with this move if you use it against the right enemy, and this adds the slightest amount of depth in large titan battles where you can grab a high damage projectile from one titan and launch it back at another that is almost dead. A good example to compare this to is the gladiator fight from Doom Eternal. Gunshots and grenades are all transformed into this one projectile that is sent back to you when it's blocking, instead of being unique based on the weapon you're using. I think the devs deserve credit for going the extra mile here. This class's core ability is the Burst Core, which creates a powerful full auto stream of shots in a single direction, which can melt a Titan's health bar if you use it properly. Unfortunately, Expedition is replaced very early on in the game, so you likely won't be getting a lot of use out of it if you don't use the Monarch in multiplayer, which didn't even exist at launch. The next loadout is Tone, which sports a moderate damage semi-auto cannon with a slight bit of explosive AoE damage. Hitting an enemy with a cannon starts a lock-on process, which is completed after 3 hits. Keep in mind that the AoE splash damage counts towards the lock, so they don't need to be direct hits, and you can use this to lock onto multiple enemies at once. This allows you to engage them with a single target tracking rocket launcher, which can do good damage if every rocket connects. Tone's other abilities are mostly utility, a frontal force field that you can shoot through but blocks enemy shots, and a sonar pulse that will give you 1 tick of your lock-on for all enemies within its scanning range. It's important to note that the tracking rockets are only 1 target per lock, but you can engage several enemies with it simultaneously as long as they are locked on, and it does not reduce the missile count in order to do this. This means that if you have 2 Titans locked and use your tracking rockets, you will fire twice as many rockets to compensate for the extra target. This means that the animation can be 2 or more times longer than normal depending on the number of lock-ons you have. This isn't really an issue since you aren't locked out of using your other defensive abilities while firing, and the animation isn't too long to begin with, but it might be something to keep in mind if you're playing on Master difficulty. The Tone class uses the Salvo Core, which fires a wall of free-fire rockets in a single direction. I use the term free fire a little loosely because it's never clear to me if they actually follow the enemy titans or not, but I know they don't fully lock onto them. The Scorch loadout, my personal favorite, is a heavy-hitting tank that requires much more finesse than the previous 2. The focus of the Scorch class is how I play the game in general, attrition, sporting a single-shot thermite grenade launcher that requires more precision due to its slow projectile speed and high bullet drop, but rewarding you with decent damage if it connects. However, only being able to fire once before reloading makes the weapon seem less reliable than some of the other classes, but the Scorch makes up for this lack of firepower with even more firepower. Your defensive ability, the Thermal Shield, melts incoming projectiles and burns nearby enemies. The Firewall lays down a straight line of thermite that damages anything that steps in it, including you. Then there are the Incendiary Traps, 2 gas canisters that can be ignited by any of your other abilities, meaning you can damage multiple enemies at once with constant AoE fire damage if they don't move out of the way. Stacking damage is very satisfying to do with this class, and the Thermite Launcher suddenly becomes a lot more powerful when you're using it in tandem with these other abilities. Then, there's the Flame Core, which allows you to lay down a wave of thermite in front of you. This ability is difficult to dodge at close range and does massive damage. The Scorch may seem overpowered, but that's only for titans that operate on the ground. This brings us to the Brute, which is the only titan that doesn't have a multiplayer equivalent. There's a reason for this. The Brute is kinda trash. Its primary weapon is a rocket launcher with 2 firing modes. Hip firing will launch 4 rockets in a helix shape, and aiming fires them 1 at a time. It has the same abilities as the Expedition class with 2 exceptions, both of which function similar to each other. Instead of launching the electric smoke, the Brute is given the ability to hover in the air for a short time. Its core ability, the Flight Core, lets you fly around and launch rockets at enemies. I haven't used the Brute class a lot, mostly because your rockets will just get redirected back at you, but I've always found it very underwhelming. The issue is that it lacks individuality. Every ability it has, including its core, is used in another titan. I've always assumed that this is why it doesn't have a multiplayer equivalent. The only thing it has going for it is the rocket launcher, but the Titan's primary weapon is only as good as the abilities backing it, and the Brute just doesn't have much going for it. I consider it to be the weakest of the Titans, although its ability to hover does make it a little annoying to fight when I'm playing as a Scourge, but it doesn't last long enough for it to become a problem. Moving on, the Ion Kit could be considered the energy-based variant to the Expedition class. Its primary weapon is a fully automatic laser rifle with 40 rounds and 2 firing modes. Firing normally only costs ammunition, but aiming will activate a split shot that does more damage and drains your energy in addition to using ammo, which is measured in a bar on the left-hand side of your screen. The Ion Kit also uses the Vortex Shield, although its other abilities include an explosive tripwire and a precision laser shot that can do decent damage if it hits a Titan's weak spot, which is usually the cockpit. However, the laser shot requires at least 50% of your energy to use, and if you drained your energy below that threshold by using the splitter, then you'll need to wait for it to recharge before you can use your laser, effectively putting it on cooldown. This makes the Ion Kit unique by being the only loadout that has a second resource that needs to be managed other than just ammo. This also adds a little more ebb and flow to this kit that many of the others don't have, but it makes it unwieldy to use if you're like me and you can't keep your energy full because you keep draining it on the splitter. Then you die because your laser shot won't activate. This kit also uses the laser core, which is practically identical to the burst core except it's a laser. I've always felt that the Ion was so similar to the Expedition kit since it's the default multiplayer and the Monarch hadn't been released yet, and I still feel this was the original intention. Up next, we have the Ronin, or as I call it, the Weeb Titan. This uses a large shotgun with rounds that can bounce off surfaces to hit enemies. The shotgun does decent damage, but it has the downside of only holding 4 rounds per magazine. This makes sense considering that the Ronin's entire style involves you to be up close. Your melee attack is replaced with a large broadsword that you can also use to block incoming damage by an impressive amount. You can also use the arc wave to leave a line of electricity on the ground that slows and damages enemies, similar to Scorch's firewall but more Japanese and not as cool. You can also use a short-term phase shift to Nothing Personal Kid teleport behind your enemies, and the Ronin's core is, naturally, the sword core. This electrifies your broadsword and does a huge amount of damage per swing. It also increases the damage of your arc wave while decreasing the damage taken while blocking. The Ronin is definitely for people who like to be up close and personal, but this channel is a certified anime free zone, so I refuse to use it based on principle alone. Other than that, it has a great balance of offensive and defensive abilities. For my third and final least favorite class, we have the North Star. Unlike the Ronin, this is a class that you want to operate from a distance, which is why it's the only Titan class that doesn't have a shield as a defensive ability. However, as much as I don't like the North Star, I have to admit that it has a very good setup. Your primary weapon is a long-range railgun that can be charged for increased accuracy and damage. Your only defensive ability is a tether that holds enemy Titans within a short range, but there is no way to directly block incoming damage. Your other ability is a cluster missile, which will do damage over time if you land a direct hit. You also have the hover ability we saw with the Brute, except it's much more useful since you can use it to get an angle on enemies with a railgun. In the same vein, the North Star also uses the flight core. This kit is a pure glass cannon, which is even more true in the multiplayer since you don't have as much health as you do in the campaign. Regardless, if you're a fan of sniping classes and you prefer to fight from a distance anyways, then this is the kit for you. I imagine that it would be too overpowered if you could get a frontal shield of sorts, and the tether is a good way to hold enemies in place so you can get a shot on them. The final kit is the Legion, capping things off with a 150 round minigun that has 2 firing modes, close range and long range. These modes are fairly self-explanatory, but they do have some other functions. Close range has more weapon spread, but is easier to use up close, whereas long range is more precise, but the zoom makes it unwieldy in close quarters. The 2 modes also affect your power shot ability. Using this in close range will knock back enemies in its path and do some impressive damage, whereas the long range power shot is more akin to a fully charged shot from the North Star, with the added bonus of hitting every enemy in its path. Needless to say, both modes of the power shot are more useful at their effective range. Your defensive ability is a shield that goes over your gun, which forces you to remain aimed in, but doesn't prevent you from switching firing modes. However, it does leave you vulnerable until the animation finishes and you aim back in, which takes about 2 to 3 seconds to complete, which is a very long time when you're actively being shot at. Your movement speed is also greatly reduced while you're aimed in, which is the trade-off for this partial frontal protection. Mostly, this exists to protect your weak spot while you send a flurry of bullets the enemy's direction. The Legion kit doesn't have a third ability like some of the other classes, but it has just as much in its arsenal when you consider the 2 different power shots. It's definitely meant to be a hard-hitting tank, but it's not the nimblest class either. This is truer for the multiplayer since it has 1 dash with a longer cooldown than some of the smaller classes like the Ronin or North Star. The Legion uses the Smart Core, which automatically locks on and engages multiple enemies at once with your minigun. there doesn't seem to be a difference in which firing mode you use with the core that I've noticed. And it's in these different Titan classes that you can see just how many different playstyles are supported in just the Titan combat. Do you like to be in the enemy's face? Use the Ronin. Do you want to fight from a distance and still do good damage? Use the Legion on long range mode or the North Star. Do you want to have an advantage in single target encounters? Then use the Tone, Ion, or Expedition. Would you rather sacrifice this advantage in favor of controlling the field against several Titans? Then use the Scourge. Do you want to use the Brute? Don't. The Titan kits are interesting to me because they take the elements of a hero shooter and translate them into these kits. There's a smaller roster than, say, Overwatch, but they manage to bring the same strengths to the table. To be truly great with your kit, you need to understand how to manage its abilities and compensate for your limitations. Killing Titans in the single player may be as simple as throwing everything you have at them until they die, but this may not be as simple against an experienced player who knows their Titan as well as you know yours. No two Titans can be played exactly the same. Each of them requires a different approach in order to be effective in combat. And so Titanfall 2's gameplay is this amalgamation of elements from other shooters that comes together to form something truly special. It takes the strengths of several different styles of the genre without managing to inherit their weaknesses. Not many shooters these days manage to have satisfying gunplay. Titanfall 2 has the best on the market. Too many futuristic shooters have awkward and clunky enhanced mobility mechanics. Titanfall 2's system feels more natural than any other I've played. So rarely has a military shooter managed to successfully introduce hero shooter elements like a specialist system without making them feel like a cheap gimmick that exists to give you the illusion of depth. Titanfall 2 as a franchise deserves to be heralded as a success story for fusing these styles together, not collecting dust in EA's vault of abandoned titles. I'm sure that some of you may think I'm exaggerating with these statements, and I acknowledge that I haven't played every first-person shooter that's released, and that some games out there must do what Titanfall 2 does equally as good or even better. However, if most of your experience comes from the more mainstream titles like Call of Duty, Battlefield, or even Halo, then Titanfall is a breath of fresh air. It's such a shame that I'm discovering this all too late to fully enjoy it. All this leaves us with is the story itself, and this is where all these gameplay elements need to come together to form a well-paced narrative that can leave the player feeling satisfied by the end. Titanfall 2 is the first, and so far, last game in this series to have a standalone campaign. The first Titanfall did have campaign missions, but they were in the form of offline multiplayer matches with some story context. A good comparison would be the original Star Wars Battlefront games. This will be important to remember during the story discussion because there are a lot of details that don't make complete sense without having played the original Titanfall, which I might remind everybody is being pulled from the shelves. But more on that later. How is Titanfall 2's campaign? To put it short, it feels like it was designed with the philosophy that the journey is more important than the destination. The narrative on its own is fairly weak, but it doesn't fully come into the spotlight until the last few missions, where the urgency of the situation is going to carry what is otherwise a very generic plot. Instead, much of the focus is on the moment-to-moment gameplay in your relationship with your Titan. The premise of the story feels bland on its own, but the execution works because more focus was put on what you're doing than why you're doing it, and much of this is handled through the gameplay. Let me explain further. Each level was given a unique premise or gimmick that makes it stand out from the previous ones. A lot of this can be attributed to the changes in environment, but some are more tangible than that. We'll be going through each level in detail later, but one thing you can't say is that they all feel exactly the same. The enemies will range from humans, robots, and various wildlife that are much tougher than you would think. The gameplay is kept fresh by constant changes in scenery, premise, and an ever-growing focus on you and your Titan as you learn to rely on each other throughout. So yes, the overarching narrative is a generic sci-fi rebellion plot with elements that feel ripped straight out of Star Wars, but a majority of what you do throughout the game is entirely unique. It's important to note that this is a byproduct of the game's development process. In an attempt to make Titanfall 2 stand out, developers were encouraged to experiment with the game systems and build prototypes with little oversight, and these action blocks, as they were called, would come to be the levels we play in, which is why they feel so distinct from each other. This means that the gameplay segments were made before the story was written, which undoubtedly caused some of the issues I have with the narrative. However, while I think that this approach explains these narrative issues, I do not think that it justifies them. Still, this approach is why the build-up to the game's climax manages to feel so interesting, and the game succeeds at this approach more than other titles who adopt the gameplay as king philosophy. Titanfall 2's core gameplay loop carries its story for a majority of the short 5 to 6 hour runtime, but is certainly not the only reason that I found it so enjoyable. The entire first half of the game is a story about your character, Jack Cooper, growing to understand and trust his Titan, BT-7274, or just BT for short. Much of this takes place during the idle chatter during platforming. You have some minor dialogue options throughout the game that will provide more information about something or crack a sarcastic joke that will be completely lost on BT, subtly reminding you that he's just a machine despite how much you will inevitably come to see him as an individual. This dynamic creates much of the comic relief throughout the game that, unlike many of the recent Marvel movies, understand that there's a time and a place for this sort of thing and doesn't undercut the game's serious moments, of which there are several. Cooper doesn't have much of a character on his own, but he has far more than the average silent protagonist seen in other shooter campaigns. Every dialogue option is within character for him, so it's mostly a matter of what you, the player, want to say in each situation. Do you want to make a sarcastic remark about something, or do you want to take things a little more seriously? This doesn't change the feeling of Cooper's character, only the tone of the conversation, but it also doesn't reach Fallout 4 levels of stupidity. However, the real star of the show is undoubtedly BT, since my thought process behind picking these options was rarely, I want Cooper to say this, and far more commonly, I want to know what BT will say if I say this. Oddly enough, this feels like a genuine organic conversation in a way that other games don't, including some RPGs. You're not saying things because you think it's the right response at the right time, you're just saying them to drive the conversation forward and prompt a response from BT in order to possibly learn something about his history or mannerisms. I credit this much more to the minimalistic nature of the dialogue options than any revolutionary progression in video game conversations. Unlike an RPG, where you have dialogue choices for a solid 80% of the conversation, Titanfall gives you choices on rare occasions, and they almost always end the conversation afterwards. Sometimes you're allowed to pick both options, but you can always abstain by waiting for the prompt to expire. It may seem weird that you're given dialogue choices if you can just pick both anyways, but it gives players who don't want the characters to be overly chatty during gameplay a chance to abstain from it. The main purpose behind these dialogue choices isn't very complicated. They exist to fill the silence between combat arenas and to help flesh out BT as a character. Despite how simple he and the other characters in this game are, he still manages to be interesting. The Titanfall universe is seemingly the only science fiction setting in a video game where the AI doesn't get wildly out of control and start fucking shit up. BT doesn't represent any difficult questions about how to handle artificial intelligence or the meaning of what defines a consciousness in life. He is a machine that is just intelligent enough to give off the impression of having a personality, but could never be described as sentient. The interesting thing then is that you can so easily forget this fact and need to be constantly reminded of it. The moment you make a joke because you forgot that he doesn't have a sense of humor, or when you're reminded that he isn't capable of emotion despite how endearing he can feel throughout the story.
BT, I found Anderson. He's, in the ceiling.
Objective complete. We have rendezvoused with Major Anderson.
It's cold, BT.
Correct. Anderson's current temperature is 17 degrees Celsius, below the threshold of human survival.
You'll likely find yourself becoming attached to him throughout the course of the game, even though he'll never be able to truly reciprocate these feelings beyond the fact that he is bound by his protocols to protect you at all costs. It's the moments where BT manages to show some semblance of personality that really makes his character shine, when he seems to defy the limitations of his intelligence by picking up the quirks or mannerisms that Cooper impresses on him. Even then, this is more like him using the neural link they share to adapt and become more compatible with his pilot than any sort of emotional development or growth. None of this is really deep or thought-provoking unless you want to spend the time overanalyzing it, but it's a testament to how people can get emotionally attached to things, even to the point of convincing yourself that an inanimate object has quirks or personality traits. You may not even realize how attached you've become to this steel behemoth until the last few chapters, but more on that later. And so it's in this contrast between the complexity of the gameplay and the simplicity of the actual story that Titanfall 2 manages to be engaging and digestible, which I would argue is a virtue for a game in this genre. Don't get me wrong, I'm just as much of a fan of a story with an interesting twist and some actual meat to its plot, but being simple isn't inherently a bad thing. There is some merit to a game that can focus on being mechanically engaging while being narratively easy to follow. However, the same simplicity becomes a problem whenever the overall story starts to suffer, and I'd be lying if I said that it never does. There are moments in this game where something is clearly lacking, when characters that should have an integral role in the plot simply don't, and when the world building suffers due to a lack of exploration. Suddenly, what was gained with this approach of a more straightforward narrative pales in comparison to what was lost, and you're left feeling less satisfied than you may have expected. The small-scale story between Cooper and BT is fulfilling, but the large-scale conflict leaves much to be desired. I found myself in an all-too-familiar situation of thinking that the game's narrative is just good when it could have been great, and some of the more interesting implications of its story and universe are left unexplored. The premise behind this game is simple. Cooper and BT fight for the Frontier Militia, an organization that was banded together to defend their home from the tyrannical Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation. The Frontier isn't talked about in much detail in-game, but we get a slightly better understanding of the IMC's motivations from some audio logs in one mission. The IMC is bleeding the Frontier colonies dry and destroying their planets for their natural resources, so the militia is standing up for themselves and growing in power. This is the stage that the entire game will play out on, and it is woefully underexplored. You get small details like how the militia turned from a ragtag group of freedom fighters into a true force to be reckoned with, and how the Vanguard Titan that their Special Forces group, known as the Special Recon Squadron, use are the first Titan that they built for themselves and didn't need to steal from the IMC. You can hear in an audio log that IMC reinforcements won't arrive from the core system for several more years. How does space travel work in this universe, and why is it such a time-consuming process? Don't get me wrong, there is a lore reason for this, but it's not one that we get an explanation for in this game, and that's true for many of the finer details of this universe. The reason for this is obvious. This is a first-person shooter. The story is taking a backseat to the gameplay in order to offer a mechanically engaging experience instead of a narrative one, and introducing a bunch of exposition dumps about the world would seriously hurt the pacing of the game. Trying to use BT's dialogue and platforming to explain everything would make him feel more like a text-to-speech encyclopedia than the individual that the writers want you to come to see him as. What Titanfall 2 is missing is a codex, something that can deliver these lore dumps to nerds like me that want them so we can get a greater understanding of this universe. Some of you watching right now are probably thinking of the game's wiki, but I personally prefer to find information about a game's universe within the game itself. However, information delivered through a codex isn't the same as learning about it through gameplay, but that approach simply wouldn't work due to the basic fact that this is not an RPG. It's a linear action experience that would suffer from too many moments of dialogue. The developers needed to decide which approach would be best for the experience, one that focuses on world building at the cost of gameplay, or one that focuses on gameplay at the cost of world building. It's obvious what the developers chose here, and I can't bring myself to say that was the wrong approach. What I'm asking for doesn't fit the strengths of the genre, and so we're left with a compromise that was absolutely necessary, but still unfortunate. But what's arguably even more unfortunate is the missed potential for the moments that are in the game, where all the pieces are in place for the narrative to deliver a very powerful moment that acknowledges how far the player has come, and yet nothing significant happens. This is related to another issue that I haven't really touched on yet. The game is too short. You would really have to try to squeeze more than 7 hours out of your experience. I spent 6.5 hours on my first playthrough, but I spent 2 hours running the Crucible at the start of the game, so the average player is going to burn through the game far quicker. The story could have really benefited from another 2 hours of content to help set up some of the big moments for a satisfying payoff. As always, I'll be going into more detail when we get to these moments, so I think it's about time we get into it. Titanfall 2 begins with a cutscene as Cooper monologues about the pilot and how they differ from regular soldiers. You're given a basic overview of their fighting style as you watch this pilot use a variety of abilities found in the different classes, such as the sonar pulse and hologram. You get a sneak peek at some Titan combat before being introduced to the premise of the story. Cooper talks about how he's lived on the frontier his whole life and talks about how the IMC has been polluting and destroying their planets for their natural resources. The militia has been victorious on various fronts, but the end of the fighting is still nowhere in sight. Cooper says that he's still a rifleman in the militia with hopes of becoming a pilot someday. The following loading screen gives you an overview about the upcoming mission. You're aboard the ship, the James McAllen, as you make your way to the IMC-controlled planet of Typhon. The planet has zero civilian presence and is home to an IMC military research facility. In the meantime, you're being trained by Master Pilot Captain Lastimosa until you reach your destination, which Cooper refers to as his mentor. The first leg of the mission itself doesn't have much to it. You do the usual look at the lights trick to set your aiming controls, then you're put in a virtual reality training session. You get a short session that introduces Lastimosa as a character and some of the basic movement controls. The simulation itself is based on Harmony, which is one of the militia homeworlds. He tells you that they've retaken a quarter of frontier space since the Battle of Demeter, which was referenced in the cutscene before. This is an event from the original Titanfall's campaign missions, but the idea seems to be that Demeter was a major refueling station that linked the core systems to the frontier, and destroying it cut the IMC off from their reinforcements, which is what the audio log I mentioned earlier was referencing. It will take several years for the IMC to get reinforcements due to their defeat at Demeter. Moving on, you get to pick your loadout for this training session from a small list of weapons that all Apex players are going to be familiar with. The takeaway of this mission is the Pilot's Crucible, which is a time-based obstacle course where the goal is to ultimately hone your skills as a pilot. You can learn a lot from this one section if you dedicate the time, and I think you should spend a minimum of 30 or 40 minutes getting the basics down before you move on. Like I said a moment ago, I spent about 2 hours doing this my first time and still didn't get the best time, although it did pay off in the long run. Once you're ready, you can move on to the Titan section of the simulation, but you're pulled out abruptly before you can finish calling it in. The IMC is trying to attack the McAllens, so the operation is now in full effect. You get a cursory glance at two characters on our list of missed opportunities, Major Anderson and Captain Cole. Anderson is another pilot who knows Lastimosa, and Cole is the head of Cooper's squad of riflemen. For now, try to keep these two in the back of your mind as we move forward. The next mission begins as we hear that the defenses on Typhon are much greater than they expected, so the McAllen is going down. We watch as you and many others take a drop pod to get planetside, and you wake up to see that the assault is in full effect. You get a very short segment where you fight alongside the other riflemen without any pilot abilities or an actual HUD, and you get jumped by an IMC Titan not even a full 5 minutes later. Lastimosa engages it just as it tries to kill you, and he disembarks afterwards to treat your wounds and drag you to a safe place. BT says that there are hostile Titans he calls apex predators in the area. Lastimosa says they're mercenaries, and it doesn't take long before he's overpowered and taken out. Cooper passes out, and he wakes up just in time to see one of the predators named Richter executing the survivors and taking their ears as a trophy. In case you weren't already aware that these guys mean business. Their leader, Cuban Blisk, says they have 18 hours until the Ark is ready for delivery, and then he tells Richter to stop being a psychopath and get moving. Cooper passes back out and wakes up when a dinosaur is trying to eat him. Lastimosa manages to scare them off with BT's gun, and he falls out of the cockpit when the hatch opens. He begins linking you to BT and tells you to take his equipment and carry on the mission. Then Cooper gives him a short burial. Let's briefly go over this introduction. Titanfall 2 falls into the trap of many action stories where a character is introduced who ends up dying not even an hour later. It doesn't go as far as trying to make it a huge emotional moment, and it's over fairly quickly, but it's still a flaw in the narrative. This ties into a larger issue with several characters throughout the story, but I consider the lack of a proper introduction to be the source of the problem. That 2-minute section of you playing as a rifleman after the tutorial needed to be a full 30-minute mission, and Lastimosa, amongst many other characters, needed to have a much greater role in it. He's still killed off in the second mission, so this wouldn't really fix the issue, but it would certainly make his death feel like little more than an excuse for you to take control of his Titan. As opposed to revisiting this issue every time we see a character it impacts, I'm going to put a pin in this discussion and bring it back up at the end of the story. You proceed through the area to find a replacement battery for BT. Nothing important really happens on your first trip. This level feels like a less restrained tutorial that gives you plenty of combat arenas to play around in. It's also when you'll realize that the tactical cloak doesn't last long enough to be a reliable stealth tool, but you can use it to get the drop on your enemies. You may also learn that you can hack enemy robots with your data knife if you can sneak up on them, but I've never actually found a use for this mechanic. You grab the battery from the wreckage of the McAllen and head back to install it. This restores BT to partial functionality, although a second battery is needed for him to be able to move and fight, but he'll contact you over the radio. You can hear some IMC grunts talking about the apex predators and their leader, but good luck getting all the dialogue before they spot you and turn hostile. All I was able to get is that Cuban Blisk used to be IMC, and that the predators are top-of-the-line mercenaries with a closed recruitment process. You grab the second battery and bring it back to BT, where you climb inside the cockpit to complete the neural link. You then go over the 3 protocols of the Vanguard Titan: link to the pilot, uphold the mission, and protect the pilot. 2 and 3 are the important ones here. You get one final tutorial over your Titan's abilities before being set loose on your first Titan opponent. Then you head off to meet with Major Anderson and complete Lastimosa's mission. The next level begins with you fighting alongside some friendly Titans for a brief moment. This is the only battle that requires you to use the Expedition loadout, and you can replace it with a Tone Kit immediately after. This level is almost entirely combat-based with little story relevance. You'll be introduced to one of the Predators, Kane. He doesn't have much of a character, especially compared to the other Predators we fight throughout the game, so there's nothing to really comment on. However, this mission is also your first taste of the game's stellar level design in unhinged combat. The Crucible didn't have enemies that shoot back. The last mission did, but the enemies were pulling their punches. This is when the game takes its hands off the steering wheel and leaves you to your own devices, so it can be surprisingly difficult at times. The final fight is an extended combat section where you're introduced to the Ticks, which are small drones that are designed to follow you while platforming and explode if you get too close. The fight lasts a full 5 minutes as you take on wave after wave of enemies until BT is able to assist, which ends the fight. You move on to kill Kane, and the fight goes about the same as every other Titan battle, except with more HP to deal with. Once he's dead, you steal his radio so that you can listen to the IMC comms, then you move on. The first stretch of the next mission is mostly Titan combat. BT says that he found a shortcut that will help you reach Major Anderson quicker, and you pick up the Scorch loadout here. Bliss comes on the radio and starts speaking with the level's predator, Ash. This level, like many others, can be as fun or as boring as you want it to be. You can play it safe and mostly focus on taking out the enemies and their Titans conventionally, or you can experiment a little, exiting BT and letting his AI take over in the more tightly packed areas and retaking control once you've cleared the room. Or maybe when a Titan is close to dead, you decide to hop on and take one of the batteries as a finishing move before climbing back into BT before they have a chance to kill you. I recommend doing some crazy stunts like this on repeat playthroughs in order to keep things fresh. BT eventually tells you that he's found another shortcut, and he needs you to go raise the cargo lift so that it can take you further into the facility. Once you do, he gets grabbed by a mechanical arm and is carried off. You take the cargo lift to follow him, but you'll end up proceeding on your own for now. This is one of my favorite levels due to its design. It's non-stop combat from the moment you enter the facility. You ride this assembly line of manufactured homes, eventually getting off to fight as it goes through some of the deadlier machinery, then hopping back on once it's safe to proceed. The arenas are mostly large open spaces with ample room for platforming, and the roller coaster design means that you can ultimately ignore most of the enemies if you just want to beeline it through the level. The intrigue here is why the IMC is mass producing these fabricated homes, which comes to a head when the building you're riding on turns itself sideways and is connected to the wall. You're forced to climb further on your own, and then you jump onto one of the moving platforms and are raised into a dome arena made of these fabricated homes. This serves as a literal combat arena where some militia grunts are brought in to fight alongside you in the upcoming battle, and then you're introduced to the Reaper, a heavy-duty mech designed to fight Titans. Needless to say, it can make short work of you and the Rifleman if you're not careful. There are anti-Titan weapons in the houses if you need them, which you most likely will if you want to survive this on the higher difficulties. Eventually, the doors will open for some IMC grunts to come in and try to finish you off, and you use it to escape. Ash comes over the intercom and lets everybody know that she's setting the facility to self-destruct due to the IMC's inability to kill you, and BT says that the explosions were enough for him to break free the mechanical arm. You make your way to another arena where you meet up with him and finish the mission off with more Titan combat. This ends with you facing off with Ash, who is quite deadly with her Ronin loadout if you're not careful. She's even more difficult if you're trying to use the Brute Kit, which I constantly forget you acquire in this mission because it's trash. Honestly, this is not a fight you want to use the Brute Kit for, since the only good defense it has against the Ronin is its ability to hover. There's nothing you can grab with the Vortex to shoot back at them when they have their sword out, so you're better off just using the Scorch or Tone for this fight if you don't want to pull your hair out. I remind Ash that this channel is a certified anime-free zone by executing her when her health is critical. BT concludes we shouldn't take any more shortcuts, and you proceed to the next mission. This level has a lot more going for it, so it'll take longer to explain. This is when much of the overarching plot is revealed to the player, including the IMC's true motivations and why you're on Typhon. You start off by exploring this abandoned facility where you'll frequently get these strange flashbacks into the past. You can ask BT about it in one of the dialogue options, and he says that there are distortions that are causing rifts in time. He says that the SRS has documented several cases on other planets, and that they're commonly caused by massive energy surges. You can find General Martyr, the main antagonist and the leader of the IMC on Typhon, giving a speech about destroying the militia in order to safeguard the human race, which you can interrupt if you walk too close to him. You then move outside where you get a look at the facility before its destruction for a brief moment before returning to present day. If you pick the right dialogue choices, BT will explain this is definitely an IMC test facility, although the large rings outside aren't IMC technology. He will then say he's picking up signs of his own data signature and concludes that the time distortions are affecting his scans. You move into the lobby of this facility where you find Major Anderson stuck halfway through the ceiling. You grab his helmet and take it back to BT to be analyzed, where you see a recording of Anderson's mission briefing with the leader of the SRS, Sarah Briggs. She tells him that 2 weeks ago, the militia intercepted IMC comms detailing that they found something on Typhon. There's a blast of energy that created the time distortions you've been dealing with, and she hands him a gauntlet that will help protect him from them. She says that the IMC contracted Blisk and his mercenaries in order to protect whatever they found here, and she explicitly tells Anderson not to go alone. Seeing as he's the only SRS body we found, he clearly didn't heed her warning. BT creates a zipline for you by chucking a pole with a power line into the wall so you can ride it up to the security building. Everything goes to shit immediately as the time distortion sends you to the past and activates all the security bots in the room, which causes the destroyed ones to reactivate when you return to the present. Thankfully, the game is more than gracious enough to give you C4 for this mission, and the bots are slow enough to not really be a threat. You can find an audio log in the next room that details how the intruder, meaning you, has some advanced technology and is slaughtering their response teams. They were told that 2 teams were wiped out of the elevators in a matter of seconds by just 1 person. You then proceed forward to Anderson's body. This is where the mission really picks up. With the time gauntlet secured, you can now control the distortions and travel between the past and present seamlessly. This replaces your cloaking ability, and trust me, you won't miss it. Each timeline is effectively paused whenever you travel to the next one, and this is used in a variety of ways. Combat is the most obvious one, and it's very satisfying to decimate a group of enemies by using it, although there can sometimes be this awkward downtime as you travel back to the present to reload your weapon before getting back to the action. There are different enemies to face in their respective timelines. The past is mostly IMC soldiers, robots, and turrets, where the future has mostly wildlife and destroyed IMC bots that can sneak up on you if you're not careful. This means that nowhere is truly safe past a certain point, and the rooms that contain big battles are used for combat in both timelines. The more interesting use of this mechanic is the platforming and the progression through the level. You'll frequently be switching timelines in order to bypass IMC defenses like laser barriers, or finding ways past destroyed parts of the facility since they're still intact in the past. The inverse is also true. You'll use these destroyed sections in the present so that you can find your way into another room that didn't have an entrance for you. It's very creative, and mixing this in with the combat and platforming has made this Titanfall 2's most popular level, and that's for good reason, because this is a really fun mechanic to play around with, and it lasts just long enough for you to see all its tricks and get rid of it before it overstays its welcome. Back to the story, you can find some holographic replays of Anderson's journey through the facility, where he explains that the IMC found a machine that can fold space and time. The weapon's power source is called the Arc, and BT will later tell you that Anderson's plan was to head to the center of the rings to get a close-up look at the weapon, so that's what we're going to do. We'll then find Anderson's final recording, where he says that they plan to use the weapon on Harmony, and then he gets jumped by a single IMC grunt. His gauntlet gets damaged in the fight, so instead of just killing this nameless mall cop that he's more than a match for, he gets tackled over the railing and dies of incompetence. I never understood how his body got from this place to where we found him. We're pretty far removed from where he ended up. I try to find this out every time I play this level and I always come up short. It just never made logical sense to me. Before proceeding with the level, let's back up and talk about some audio logs. This is the only level in the game that features them, and there are quite a few of them to find. Some of these are left by an IMC scientist who survived the Arc's blast but eventually starved to death in the facility, which is the only time we're reminded that the people of the IMC are still human and aren't just comically evil corporate-sponsored space terrorists. So this must have been the work of a rogue writer, considering how everything else in the game is portrayed. You can also hear some logs about how the other scientists on the team didn't agree with this test and thought it was too risky, but they went forward with it anyways because what Martyr wants, Martyr gets. It's no surprise that Martyr was transferred to a remote observation while his science crew was left to die in the explosion or starve to death while waiting to be rescued after broadcasting his distress signal to the rest of the IMC fleet. You can also find an audio log where Martyr was experimenting on colonists related to another lore detail that this game doesn't bother explaining, so neither will I, and the goal was to test the long-lasting effects of the Arc on people, which you can see in the present caused them to decay rapidly. Lastly, and most importantly, you can find a log featuring the full presentation that Martyr gave at the start of the mission. It's quite lengthy, so I'll summarize. He starts off the speech by explaining that there is no value to human life. More specifically, he believes that human life is expendable. He talks about how there aren't enough resources to go around, and how the increasing population of the different colonies is perpetuating this. He mentions that millions of people die every day for a multitude of different reasons, and he calls it irresponsible to objectively say that each and every human life is indispensable, and he doubles down that it is, in fact, expendable. He then gets into the meat of the issue. There's a shortage of natural resources that is being consumed by the core systems, and the war with the militia is interfering with their ability to deliver. It will take several years for reinforcements to arrive due to the battle at Demeter, and the militia is rapidly growing in strength and retaking planets. So the only solution is a drastic one: to use the Fold weapon as the Titanfall equivalent of a Death Star and destroy militia planets until they surrender. He reveals that there are actually two Fold weapons, and this one is a small-scale test. The Fold weapon uses concentrated gravitational waves to shred molecules apart, which is what will be done to the militia planets if you don't stop them. It'll result in a catastrophic loss of life, which he says will ultimately be replaced in the long run. General Martyr's speech interested me for the simple reason that what he says makes sense from a utilitarian perspective. He admits that his thesis is distasteful and urges the listener to look through the lens of cold objectivity towards what he is saying. He's an uncompassionate villain, but he has the benefit of fighting for his own greater cause instead of simply wanting power for the sake of power. The only reason he is resorting to using the Fold weapon is because the war cannot be won conventionally due to their inability to get reinforcements. I wouldn't go as far as calling his methodology correct or morally just, but I can appreciate a villain who has logical reasons backing their actions, instead of just doing evil things for seemingly no reason at all. Looking at you, Fallout 4 Institute, looking at you. However, it needs to be said that regardless of how interesting this speech is, General Martyr himself falls flat by never actually making an appearance in-game. Blisk and the Predators are the true antagonists of this story, and Martyr has nothing going for him if you didn't listen to these audio logs. Getting back to the story, you loop back to the lobby and return to BT, and you're now able to bring him in the past with you. There are several Titans to fight in this area, and it can get pretty chaotic. You hack the bridge controls to get close to the Arc so you can initiate the scan, which pushes Martyr to fire the weapon prematurely, causing the Arc to lose stability and resulting in an explosion. The time gauntlet stops functioning, and you see that time was frozen completely in the middle of the blast. You do a short platforming section that feels more interesting than it actually is due to the fact that you're the only thing moving, and you end off by scanning the Arc. The time gauntlet is is broken when you return to the present, and BT says you need to get the data from the scan to the militia fleet. I have one more tangent before we move on. BT tells you that your actions in the past have made the remaining security bots hostile in the present, and I don't think the writers properly thought out the implications of something like this. For starters, this doesn't make any sense. Anderson went through the facility before you did, and unless he was playing things more stealthily, he should have already caused enough security concerns for the bots to shoot on sight. This also begs the question of why you can't find Anderson and save him if you're able to change the timeline with your presence. You were both traveling back to the exact moment in time, so while I can believe that he may not have been in the room the exact moment you were, you should still be able to find him or his body. I can theorize how or why he ended up in the state we found him in, or we can just accept that the story was written after the level was designed and they needed a way for Anderson to be at the beginning so you can get his gauntlet, but still be far enough into the facility to explain the IMC's plans with the fold weapon. However, this also causes issues with General Martyr himself. Remember what I said a moment ago while describing the time gauntlet. The timeline you are not currently in is effectively paused while you are not in it, so the logical thing to do would be to hack the database with your knife, find out where Martyr's remote observation post is, then travel to the location in the present and execute him before the security even knows you're in the room. This fold weapon may still fire, but without the IMC's Bulldog on the scene, the likelihood of the remaining science team using this weapon to wipe out the militia is very slim. There's also a much smaller issue with this concept. You can interrupt Martyr's speech by approaching him at the start of the level, but this doesn't change the audio log we just went over. But somehow you can find an audio log about you taking out 2 response teams at the elevators before you had even done it. If your rebuttal is, "That was Anderson," then I reiterate, why wasn't the security already hostile? There's even verifiable evidence that what you do has tangible effects on the timeline. Killing enemies in the past will cause their decomposed bodies to spawn in the same spot in the present. This is a really nice attention to detail, but it makes this plot point a lot messier as a result. If killing the IMC troops in this facility is enough to cause a reaction in the future, then what sort of other butterfly effect issues are we facing? Is it possible to drastically change the course of history by using these distortions to travel back in time and kill certain figures? This is basically a plot hole, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time picking the scab just to prove a point because I think it sort of speaks for itself. Time travel is a very convoluted concept and the rules surrounding it aren't always clear. I can accept and even understand that the writers didn't put a lot of thought into this concept because it exists to be a gameplay gimmick, and a very fun one at that. It causes some serious problems with the narrative, and this absolutely deserves pointing out, but I also don't want to make it a bigger deal than it's worth. There are much bigger and more noticeable issues coming up, so let's go ahead and just move on. You and BT move on to an IMC interstellar beacon to upload your findings from the ARC scan to the militia fleet. You find a group of riflemen holding out against a wave of killer robots, so you pick up the Ronin kit and proceed to not use it while saving them. Inside, you see Captain Cole, the same Captain Cole who Cooper served under while he was a rifleman, and he doesn't even acknowledge that you're not only still alive, but running around with Lastimos's Titan. Seeing as you only see Cole one time after the tutorial, you may not even realize it's the same person. This is a big missed opportunity to have somebody who knew Cooper before he was a pilot remark on your accomplishments, but instead you're just treated like an errand boy. The missed potential is so obvious that it physically hurts me every time I get to this section, but this also ties back into my larger problems with the characters in this story, so for now let's put a pin in this discussion and move on. Your goal is to travel to this facility's substation to find an arc tool so you can jumpstart the beacon's power supply. You do some platforming in combat before finally locating the arc tool, which can be used to interact with certain panels to open doors and controls the various turbines throughout the facility. This adds some slight puzzle mechanics as you make your way back to the rifleman, capping off with a high-speed platforming section as your speed is boosted drastically by one of the turbines, then a final test over a large chasm that has you disabling 3 turbines so you can wall run on them without stopping. Failing to disable them will result in you getting blown away, and I remember this being much more difficult than it actually is. You return to Cole with the arc tool, and he tells you to use it to jumpstart the beacon's power grid. This task is timed as the room is highly radioactive, and you can speed it up by wall running on the centerpiece while zapping the panels. Cole tries to boot up the broadcast station, but you find the uplink targeting module is offline. You can't bypass it without sending a message to the entire IMC fleet, so you and BT head out to try and repair it. BT finds a functional uplink module on a stripped-down satellite dish hanging by a crane at a nearby construction site, which is located across another chasm. BT suggests throwing you, which is a nice callback to one of the dialogue options from the previous level.
Nice. Maybe next time you can throw me.
Noted.
This works, and you hear Bliss come over the radio and tell Richter to kill you. For those of you who don't remember, because why would you, Richter is the psychopath from the beginning who was ripping off the soldiers' ears to take his trophies. He then notifies the IMC of your position, which kickstarts another set of combat arenas with ample room for platforming. You can use the arc tool to open certain doors or activate a few sets of stalkers to fight for you, which helps out when the IMC starts calling in Reapers. The platforming gimmick for this section is using the cranes to angle these wall running points where you need them, and the area ends off with a larger battle before you retrieve the uplink module from the satellite dish. You then use the arc tool in a similar way for how you handled the turbines before, where you activate these platforms to create a path forward that you can platform on. The IMC then begins attacking BT, so you use one of their zip lines to return to him and clear the area. BT then throws you to a platform near the top of the satellite dish so you can replace the uplink module. This is another short platforming section where you hear Sloan, one of the mercenaries, come on the line and inform him that Ash and Kane are dead, and that Kane's radio has been taken. He immediately figures out that it was you and tells you to back off while you still have a chance. You then replace the module, which causes the satellite dish to start repositioning, also causing Cooper to slide off the edge and towards his death until BT catches you. You head back to the control room where Richter begins his assault on the rifleman's position. You fend off various Reapers and Titans before Richter drops in to handle things himself. The fight is laughably easy if you're using the Ronin kit and already charged your sword core, and after getting yet another execution, Cole and the crew fire up the beacon so you can begin the broadcast. You receive a response from Sarah Briggs, and BT transmits the information over to her. You then cut to later where you're speaking with her face to face. She's surprised to learn that Lastimosa linked BT to a rifleman and says that she'll get him transferred to a qualified pilot. BT objects, saying that you are his pilot and that your combat effectiveness rating is above 90%. He requests to keep you as his pilot, and she finally relents and agrees. She then says that she's tracked the Ark's energy signature to an IMC airbase here on Typhon, so you both prepare for a frontal assault. The next mission is all Titan combat, so there's very little to mention. You drop in with Sarah and the rest of the SRS and go through the most difficult gauntlet of Titan battles in the entire game as you make your way to the Draconis, the name of the ship that the Ark is being transported on. Sarah tells you halfway through the mission that you've earned your pilot certification as far as she's concerned, and you can pick up the North Star kit. You fight your way to the Draconis just in time to see it take off, so you book it to the nearest ship to follow them. What remains of your fleet tries to catch up before you're attacked by Viper, another Predator with a modified North Star Titan that allows him to fly around for longer periods of time. He blows up your transport and you're caught by Barker, the sarcastic hotshot ace pilot archetype of this game. More characters we haven't met, pilots of a group called the 6-4, tell you that they can get you to a nearby freighter that is tearing up your fleet. BT throws you onto their ship and they pilot you towards the vessel so you can get on board. Your first objective is to take out the guns that are firing on your own freighter, and it goes down before you can take out the cannons. You finish disabling them, and the 6-4 comes aboard to help you get to the bridge so you can disable the anti-air cannons. This takes you through probably the largest and most tightly packed infantry battle in the game as you fight through the hangar bay. This is the only time in the entire game that you will fight alongside other pilots without their Titans outside of multiplayer. You proceed to breach the main deck and hack the ship with your data knife to steer it towards the Draconis. Barker swings by to drop off BT, and what proceeds is the toughest boss fight in the game. Viper is deadly for a variety of reasons. The fact that he can fly around indefinitely makes him a Scorchmaid's nightmare, but he also has the benefit of the North Star sniper rifle, which means you're not safe at any distance. You also need to take on 2 Scorch Titans, which aren't the hardest to fight, but are some of the tankier ones. I recommend using the Tone Kit for this fight for a few reasons. You have the benefit of lock-on rockets and a forward shield, which the North Star Kit lacks. The semi-auto cannon is less costly to miss than the railgun, and it still does good damage. A good defense is necessary in this fight since Viper can be very deadly if you're not careful. You might be able to get away with the Ion or Expedition kit, but I think the Tone is still the best bet for this encounter. Once he's defeated, BT prepares to throw you onto the Draconis when Viper grabs you both and takes you into the air. You land on the Draconis and BT goes to tackle him. They scuffle for a minute before Viper takes off one of BT's arms and the hatch to Viper's cockpit is blown open by a rocket. You end the fight by shooting Viper in the head, killing him for good. This causes him to fire several rockets that take down the Draconis, so you drop into the ship, scaring a bunch of IMC grunts in the process, and they take all the escape pods. You make it to the Ark and push it into BT's cockpit, but you don't have a way off the Draconis.
Get the Ark out of here!
Negative. You're trapped.
What are you doing?
Protocol 3. I will not lose another pilot. Brace for impact.
You come to just in time to see Blisk and Sloan talking to General Martyr. Blisk tells him off and says to have his money ready for when he delivers the Ark. Sloan tells him to let her rip it out of BT, and he tells her that the Ark is too unstable. He then threatens to shoot you in the head if you don't tell BT to open the hatch, which gives him an idea. He pretends that his ocular systems were damaged, so Blisk will bring you closer to him, then sends you an encrypted message saying to trust him. He opens the hatch and tries to attack Blisk, then kills the guards with his rocket launcher. Blisk gets away and Sloan gets a hold of the Ark, then puts him down.
Nice try, love. Say goodnight.
It's a pretty emotional moment after all the time you spent with him, and you wake back up with your only objective being to survive. You're locked in this room that is on fire after BT's rocket struck some oil barrels, and you're stripped of all your equipment. BT calls you over to him and says that he can no longer uphold the mission, but you still can. He tells you to take something called the Sear Kit, saying it's your only chance for survival. Inside BT's eyepiece is a gun and a data knife, as well as his data core. You use the knife to hack the door to the room, and you get your first look at the Sear Kit's capabilities. The Sear Kit stands for Survive, Evade, Resist, Escape, which is communicated to you through the mission objective. The combination of the pistol with BT's data core gives you literal aimbot. Once you've acquired a target, you will not miss. I feel that this perfectly exemplifies just how much the developers were willing to go against the grain for the sake of fun. The section only lasts a few minutes, but it still manages to be one of the most memorable and enjoyable platforming sections of the game. Once you reach the end of it, Sarah contacts you and says that she has one more Vanguard class Titan in the racks, and that she's pulling its data core and preparing it for Titanfall. You call in your new Titan and install BT's data core, which transfers him to his new body, with a Legion kit to boot. You go through the final gauntlet of Titan combat as you mail everything in your path with your new toys and watch as the militia lays down firing support for you. You make it to the fold weapon just in time to see Sloan and Blisk load it into the Ark, then you get your chance for some payback. Sloan is a tough fight, but for different reasons than Viper was. You have several Titans to contend with, and she'll disappear at different increments, making her the only boss that you can't just burst down as quickly as possible. She's a tough cookie, but she's also no match for you by this point in the game. Once she's dead, you and BT try to pull the Ark out of the fold weapon but aren't fast enough to stop it from firing. The blast of energy it puts off disables much of BT's systems, but he's able to restore his ocular systems in time for you to see Blisk arrive while you're still paralyzed.
It's your lucky day, hero. I'm not going to kill you. I don't work for free. But you don't get to kill me either.
Once he leaves, BT says randomly that a throw is the only option here. It's pretty easy to dismiss as his system's being fried while he's rebooting, but I'm bringing it up so there's no point in hiding the fact that it's important to note. BT tells you to pilot him to the Arc Injector so he can destroy the fold weapon from the inside, since the militia has been throwing everything they have at it and didn't put a dent in the machine. He plans to use his reactor core to destabilize and destroy the Ark. He sends Sarah some coordinates to a dropship rendezvous point, but she says she doesn't know how he plans to get out of there alive. There's one final dialogue option that calls back to a previous one of the first choices you had in the game.
Well, don't worry, BT. I'm not going anywhere.
Understood, but I do recommend you move. IMC salvage teams are not far away.
Don't worry, BT. I'm not going anywhere.
Copy that, pilot. Protocol 3. Protect the pilot.
BT, what are you doing?
Trust me.
BT!
Cooper, we just lost BT signal. We're almost there.
With BT sacrificing himself to destroy the Ark, you make your way to the coordinates and jump into the shuttle. Burger gets you off the planet before the fold weapon explodes, completely destroying Typhon in the process. Which is why they established at the start of the game that there were no civilians. Sarah commends you and BT for your work, saying that a lot of people owe their lives to you both. The militia fleet returns to Harmony, and Cooper monologues that he's being inducted into the SRS under Sarah and is set to receive a new Titan. You then get an animated credits sequence that shows off all the character models you may not have gotten a good enough look at throughout the game. It's a good ending to a short campaign, but after so many hours getting attached to BT, it's really hard to see him go. Like Cooper says at the end of his monologue,
I don't know what that'll feel like, to get assigned a new Titan. I kinda like the old one.
I really like Titanfall 2's campaign, but my most recent playthroughs made me see just how much better it could have been all around. This is where we bring back that discussion that I put on hold earlier when talking about Cole. The second half of the game introduces a lot of characters that are meant to have story relevance, but weren't given the time to. The issue ultimately starts with Lastimos' death, but it doesn't end there. I mentioned earlier how the first mission needs to be much longer in order to properly introduce these characters, and I stand by that. What I didn't mention is that all of these characters needed to be introduced in that first mission. The game should start off with you fighting alongside Cole and the other riflemen. The IMC Titan should show up and ruin everybody's day, but the mission should continue after Lastimosa saves you. You should have a chance to watch as the Titan battles rage on while you're left defenseless on the ground, essentially making you the IMC grunts that you step on like a bug with BT the entire game. This gives you slightly more time with Lastimosa, but would also give more meaning to the fact that you get to be the pilot going forward. The level should then progress to introduce Barker and the 6-4. Maybe they were ordered to back up the riflemen after shit hit the fan, so he's their transport to the ground. You then get to see how pilots fight up close, which would have the same effect as you watch the Titan battles. You would feel very vulnerable and restricted without the added mobility of the jump kit. You could then proceed to an open environment where another Titan appears, and then the sequence plays where Lastimosa saves you and is killed by the Predators. Adding this to the level would do a lot of good not only for the narrative, but also to the gameplay. It would further complement the build-up that already exists of fighting as a rifleman, to fighting as a pilot without your Titan, to finally fighting with your Titan after BT has been restored. Although this can't be the only change, there needs to be more dialogue between Cooper and Cole after they meet at the broadcasting station. It's a borderline plot hole that he doesn't remark on the fact that one of the riflemen under his command that he probably thought was dead is running around in a Vanguard class Titan. All the elements for a powerful moment that makes this character reflect on how far they've come is here, but it's never delivered. This is probably my biggest disappointment with this game, but this certainly doesn't extend to the ending. Watching BT sacrifice himself is a very emotional high point for the game. He's a simple character, but he's endearing in his own right. You watch him slowly adapt to Cooper's personality through little moments like him learning how to do the thumbs up after catching you at the satellite dish, and then repeating that after you kill Viper to let you know he's okay. I can't help but feel that Big Hero 6 was an inspiration for his character in some capacity, since he shares a lot of qualities that Baymax does, except BT is a 20-foot killing machine. One last thing to note before we wrap up is that there is a post-credit scene that shows the visor on Cooper's helmet flickering, and the pattern can be translated from binary to say, Jack? This insinuates that some form of BT has managed to live on through his helmet, so he may not be quite so dead after all. This is something I'd really like to see explored in Titanfall 3. Oh, that's right. And so, despite my criticisms, petty or otherwise, I think that Titanfall 2 has a very good campaign. It's a blast to play through every time, and it facilitates much of the best aspects of this game in a controlled environment that is entirely safe from DDoSers. It's very fun, and it deserves more than what it's gotten. I understand that Apex has its fans, but there's a much greater story to be told with Titanfall, and we are 5.5 years removed from the last entry. And that's at least 2.5 years overdue in my book. This franchise deserves much more than a free-to-play battle royale that forgets that the actual Titans are what made it stand out to begin with. I don't want Apex gone, but it's not a replacement for Titanfall either. You'd think that EA would understand this considering that they also own the Battlefield franchise, but seeing as how Battlefield 2042 turned out, well, I guess not. Maybe, after EA has gone through enough corporate restructuring, we may go back to receiving good games. Or maybe they'll be bought out by another company that has way too much disposable cash and a history of violating antitrust laws. All of this remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. Titanfall 2 will go down in my mind as one of the greatest and most memorable first-person shooters that the 2010s produced. We can only hope that it receives the respect it deserves from the companies that own it. As always, thank you guys for watching this video, and it's about time I get back to that other project I've been working on for the last few months. I guess I'll see you around when it's finished?